The day I walked into my father's house wearing my hospital badge, he didn't even look up from the hockey game. That's the part I always come back to. Not the argument that happened later, not the look on his face when everything finally fell apart. Just that one moment where I stood in the doorway with 3 years of residency behind me, and he was watching the Leafs game like I'd gone out for milk. My mother saw me first. She came from the kitchen wiping her hands on a dish towel and hugged me the way she always did. Tight, and a little too long, like she was making up for something she couldn't name. She smelled like the same fabric softener she'd used my whole life. Some things don't change. I used to find that comforting. That day, it just made me feel like I was 11 years old again. "Your father's in the living room," she said quietly, like she was giving me a warning. She didn't need to. I already knew what I was walking into. I'd driven 4 hours from Toronto. I'd taken a Friday afternoon off, which, if you've ever done a residency at a teaching hospital, you know is not a small thing. I had 2 patients I'd handed off to a colleague, a stack of charts I'd deal with on Sunday night, and a weekend bag in the back of my car that I'd packed at 6 in the morning before my shift. I'd done all of that because my father had called my mother and told her it would be nice if the family came together for Thanksgiving. He hadn't called me directly. He never called me directly. I should explain something about my father. He's not a cruel man in the obvious ways. He doesn't yell. He doesn't insult. He has never once in my entire life said anything that could be quoted back to him as clearly unkind. What he does is something harder to explain. Something you only understand if you've grown up with it. He withholds. He redirects. He talks about other people's children the way a person might describe a beautiful painting they saw in a museum, with this reverent, almost wistful admiration. And then he turns to look at you and just says nothing. The silence isn't accidental. It's curated. My brother Patrick had gotten into law school the year I started my undergrad. My father took him to dinner at a steakhouse in Mississauga, the kind of place with white tablecloths, where the bill comes in a leather folder. I remember because I wasn't invited. Not explicitly uninvited. Just not mentioned. My mother told me about it afterward like it was a normal thing, and I think she genuinely believed it was. She'd grown up with that kind of normal too. I got into medical school 2 years later. We had chicken stir-fry at home. My father said, "That's good news," and went back to reading the paper. I told myself it didn't matter. I was 22, and I was going to be a doctor, and I had a whole life ahead of me that had nothing to do with my father's approval. I told myself that for a very long time. The thing about telling yourself something enough times is that eventually you start to hear the effort in it. That Thanksgiving, I sat down on the couch across from him and said hello. He looked over, nodded, and said, "You look tired, not how are you, not glad you made it. Just, you look tired. Long drive," I said. He turned back to the game. My brother arrived an hour later with his wife and their 2 kids, and the whole house changed the way it always did when Patrick walked in. My father stood up. Actually stood up off the couch and crossed the room. They shook hands the way men do when they're proud of each other, and then my father ruffled my nephew's hair and picked up my niece and said, "There she is," with more warmth in those 3 words than he directed at me in the past decade combined. I went to help my mother in the kitchen. She was making the same things she always made. Roast turkey, mashed potatoes, green beans with slivered almonds, a cranberry sauce from a recipe her own mother had given her. The kitchen was warm and smelled like butter and thyme, and for a few minutes I just stood at the counter chopping celery and letting the noise of the house wash over me. My niece was shrieking with laughter in the living room. My brother was telling some story about a case he'd worked on. My father was laughing. My mother glanced at me sideways. She had this look she got, not pity exactly, more like a kind of helpless recognition. She'd watched this dynamic my entire life, and she'd never known what to do with it. I don't think she ever really believed there was anything to do. "He's just not good with emotions," she said. "Not for the first time." "I know," I said. "Not for the first time." We ate dinner. My father asked Patrick about a case he'd mentioned in September, remembered the details, asked follow-up questions. He asked my sister-in-law about her mother's health. He told a story about a colleague of his who'd recently retired after 40 years with the same company. And the way he told it, you could hear the respect in his voice, that hushed, almost reverent tone he reserved for people he considered worth admiring. He did not ask me about my residency. He did not ask what I was specializing in. He did not ask what it was like to live alone in a 1-bedroom apartment in a city I'd moved to without knowing a single person, to work 30-hour shifts and then drive home in the dark and eat cereals standing over my kitchen sink because I was too tired to sit down. He asked me to pass the gravy. After dinner, While my brother and his wife were getting the kids into their coats, my father and I ended up alone in the kitchen for approximately 4 minutes. I was rinsing plates. He was looking for the container of leftovers my mother had set aside for him to take to work on Monday. "Patrick's firm is doing well," he said, mostly to himself. "That's good," I said. "He's up for partnership next year." "I know," he told me. My father found the container, put it in the bag my mother had left on the counter, and then stood there for a moment like he was considering saying something else. I kept rinsing plates. I didn't turn around. I think some part of me already knew that if I turned around and looked at him, whatever was on my face in that moment would be something I couldn't take back. He left the kitchen without saying anything. I stood at the sink for a while after he was gone. The water ran warm over my hands. Outside, I could hear my brother's car starting up, my niece calling out something cheerful, my mother saying goodbye from the front porch. The house went quiet in that particular way it always did after Patrick left, like a thermostat dropping 10 degrees. I drove back to Toronto the next morning before anyone else was awake. I left a note on the kitchen table. I told myself the drive was fine, that the flat gray highway through November farmland was fine, that everything was fine. I cried somewhere around Barrie. Not dramatically, not the kind of crying that comes with sound, just tears quiet and continuous, that I didn't bother to wipe away for a while because there was no one to see them. I was 31 years old. I had a medical degree. I was in my second year of a cardiology fellowship at one of the best hospitals in the country. And I was crying alone on the 400 because my father had not asked me a single question about my life over an entire Thanksgiving dinner. That was the moment I understood something I'd been circling for years without wanting to land on it. It was never going to happen. Not because my father was a bad person. Not because he didn't love me in whatever way he was capable of loving. But because in his mind what I was doing didn't fully register as something worth admiring. A daughter who was a doctor was fine. A son who was a lawyer, that was the story worth telling. I wish I could say that realization freed me. It didn't. Not right away. What it did was make me very, very focused. The cardiology fellowship consumed the next 2 years of my life in a way that I think only other physicians really understand. You stop measuring time in days or weeks. You measure it in rotations, in patience, in the particular exhaustion that lives behind your eyes after a night on call. My social life contracted down to a small group of colleagues who were going through the same thing. People I'd eat terrible food with at 2 in the morning in the hospital cafeteria. People who understood without explanation why I sometimes went 3 weeks without returning a personal call. My mother texted. Occasionally she called. We talked about her garden, her book club, a trip she and my father were planning to Portugal. She asked about my apartment, whether I was eating properly. She did not relay anything my father had said about me, because there was nothing to relay. He and I spoke perhaps 4 times in those 2 years. Brief, transactional conversations. Fine, how's the drive? Fine. You should get snow tires if you don't have them. I have them, I said. Good, he said. Okay, take care of yourself. There was a period probably about 8 months into the fellowship when I stopped hoping. That's the only way I can describe it. The hoping just ended. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't make a decision. I just noticed one day that I had stopped composing conversations in my head. Those imaginary conversations where I finally said something that made him understand, that made him look at me the way he looked at Patrick, that made him proud. I noticed I had stopped having those conversations, and I realized they'd been running in the background of my mind for most of my adult life, and now they were gone. The quiet where they used to be felt strange for a while. Then it just felt like space. I finished my fellowship ranked at the top of my cohort. I was offered a staff position at a hospital in Vancouver, which meant leaving Ontario, leaving my mother, leaving the city I'd lived in for 6 years. It was the kind of offer you don't turn down. It came with a research appointment, a teaching role, and a salary that made the last decade of sacrifice feel, for the first time, mathematically rational. I called my mother. She cried a little and said she was proud of me and asked how often I'd be able to fly home. I said as often as I could manage. She said that was good enough. I did not call my father. I told myself it was because I was busy. I was packing, I was tying up loose ends at the hospital, I was handling 100 logistical details at once. All of that was true. But the real reason was simpler. I didn't expect his reaction to be one I wanted to remember. My mother must have told him, because a week before I left he called me. I almost didn't answer. He told me he'd heard about Vancouver. He said it sounded like a good opportunity. He said the cost of living out there was high, which was practical information delivered in the tone of practical information. He said I should be careful driving in the mountains in winter. It's a big job, he said eventually. Like he was testing the words. It is, I said. There was a pause that lasted long enough that I thought the call might just end there, and then he said, well, good luck with it. And that was that. I drove across the country in early March with my car packed full and a playlist I'd made specifically for the trip. I crossed into British Columbia on a Tuesday afternoon when the mountains were doing that thing they do, where the light catches the snow on the peaks, and the whole sky looks like something out of a painting you thought you'd made up. I pulled over at a rest stop somewhere past Revelstoke and sat with the engine off for a while, just looking. It occurred to me, sitting there, that no one in my family had ever driven across the country. My parents had flown everywhere. Patrick had never lived outside of Ontario. I was the first one to do this particular thing, and there was no one to tell about it in a way that would make it land the way it deserved to. I took a photo of the mountains and sent it to my mother. She sent back a heart emoji and told me to drive safe. I started the car and kept going. I'd been in Vancouver for about 8 months when the hospital's annual fundraising gala was announced. It's one of those events that exists in every major hospital, the kind where donors in formal wear come to feel connected to the institution, where administrators give speeches, where the work of the hospital is translated into a language that people with money can understand and appreciate. I'd attended one the previous year as a junior staff member, standing near the edges, talking to colleagues. This year was different. The chief of cardiology had been asked to present the department's research highlights at the gala. He'd been dealing with a family matter. His father had been ill, and 3 days before the event, he asked if I would step in. I want to be clear about what this means in a hospital context. You don't present department research highlights at a major donor event as a junior staff member. It's the kind of thing chiefs do, department heads do. Being asked to do it as someone who'd been on staff for less than a year was unusual enough that several of my colleagues mentioned it. I said yes, obviously. I went home and I worked on the presentation until 1 in the morning. And then I worked on it again the next night. And by the time the event arrived, I had something I was genuinely proud of. Research on cardiac outcomes in underserved populations. The kind of work that actually mattered, translated into language that could move people to fund it. My mother called the week of the event, and I mentioned it to her in passing. She said that was wonderful and asked if I had something nice to wear. I didn't mention it to my father. The gala was held at the Fairmont in downtown Vancouver. I wore a navy dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion and spent considerably more money on than I usually would. I told myself it was an investment in looking like I belonged in the room, which I suppose was true in more than one way. I arrived early to review the setup. The room was already being configured. Round tables with white linens, centerpieces with white flowers, a stage at the far end with a podium and a projection screen. I walked the room once, checked in with the AV team, ran through the slide transitions, professional habits. The kind of thing you do when you've learned that the only things you can fully control are the things you prepare for. I was standing near the edge of the stage, talking to one of the event coordinators when I noticed them. My father and my mother, standing near the entrance. I stopped mid-sentence. I had no idea they were coming. I had never mentioned the event to my father. My mother had known about it, but she hadn't said anything about traveling to Vancouver. She'd just said it was wonderful and asked about the dress. I stood there for a full second trying to understand what I was seeing. My mother spotted me from across the room. She waved, a small, careful wave, like she wasn't sure of the reception. My father was looking around the room with the expression he always wore in formal settings, a kind of appraising attention, like he was cataloging who was worth speaking to. I excused myself and crossed the room. My mother hugged me. She was wearing the blue blazer she saved for special occasions. "We wanted to surprise you," she said into my shoulder. "You did," I said. My father shook my hand, actually shook my hand, like I was a colleague he was being introduced to at a conference. He looked around the room again, taking in the chandeliers, the length of the tables, the people in formal wear moving through the space. "Night's event?" he said. "It's the hospital's annual gala," I said. "There'll be a few hundred people here tonight." He straightened his tie. "Anyone important coming?" I looked at him for a moment. "The provincial health minister is expected," I said. "And several of the hospital's major donors. Some of them fund cardiac research specifically." He nodded slowly, in that way he had. That particular nod that meant he was recalibrating something. My mother touched my arm. "We're so proud of you," she said quietly. And I could tell she meant it, and I could tell she was also trying to smooth something in advance, the way she always had. I smiled at her. I told them to find a table and enjoy themselves. I said I had a few things to take care of before it started. I walked back toward the stage and I stood with my back to the room for a moment, just breathing. My hands were steady. I was surprised to find my hands were steady. I'd given hospital presentations before. I'd presented research at conferences in front of rooms full of physicians who asked sharp questions. I knew how to speak in public, and I knew how to make an argument, and I knew how to hold a room. What I didn't quite know, standing there, was how to do all of that with my father watching from a table somewhere in the audience. But I also understood, standing there, that this was exactly the moment I'd been preparing for without knowing it. Not this room, not this event specifically, but this feeling. The feeling of doing something real and substantial in front of someone who had never believed you were capable of it. The room filled. The lights adjusted. The hospital president welcomed the guests and gave a brief speech about the institution's mission. There were introductions, a video, a moment where the lights went down and you could hear the room settle into attention. And then my name was called. I walked to the podium. The room was larger than it had felt before, and quieter, 300 people. Maybe more. White tablecloths, candlelight, the faces of donors and administrators and physicians and board members, all turned toward the stage. And somewhere in the middle of that room, my father. I didn't look for him. I looked at the room the way I'd been trained to look at a room. As a space to hold, an audience to reach. I took one breath and I started. I talked about the data. I talked about what the numbers meant in human terms. The patients behind the statistics. The communities that cardiac disease was hitting hardest. The gaps in care that existed not because of a lack of medicine, but because of a lack of funding for the research that would close them. I talked about what the hospital was doing, and why it mattered, and what was still left to do. I spoke for 18 minutes. I'd rehearsed for 13. The extra 5 came from somewhere I don't fully understand. From the room maybe, from the quality of attention that builds when people are genuinely listening. When I finished, the applause started before I reached the end of the last sentence. I stepped back from the podium. The event coordinator was at my elbow immediately, guiding me to the side of the stage. The hospital president was on his feet. A woman I recognized as the chair of the board was leaning over to say something to the person next to her. And whatever she said made that person start clapping harder. I stood at the side of the stage while the next portion of the program began, and I looked at my hands, and they were still steady. Afterward, during the reception, I found my parents at their table. My mother stood up when she saw me coming and took both my hands in hers. She didn't say anything for a moment, which was not like her. Her eyes were bright. "That was extraordinary," she said finally. "Thank you for coming," I said. "I still can't believe you came. Your father wanted to," she said. I looked at him. He was still seated. He had his glass of water in his hand and he was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not pride, exactly, or not just pride. Something more complicated than that. Something that looked, if I'm being honest, a little like being caught. Like a man who has been holding a certain story about the world and has just seen evidence that the story was wrong. He set the glass down. He didn't say anything extraordinary. He didn't apologize. He didn't try to recount my entire speech back to me or list the impressive things I'd said. He just looked at me and said, "You were very good up there." 5 words. "You were very good up there." I don't know what I'd expected. Something bigger maybe. Some version of the scene I'd imagined in all those years of imagined conversations. The one where he finally saw me, really saw me, and said the right words that unlocked everything and made all of it make sense. But that's not how it works. That's not how any of it works. What I said was, "Thank you for coming all this way." And what he said was, "Your mother wanted to see Vancouver." And I almost laughed. I almost actually laughed, because of course that's what he said. But here is the thing I understood. Standing there in that room full of people who had just watched me do something real. It didn't land the way it would have before. There was a time when that sentence, "Your mother wanted to see Vancouver," would have knocked something loose in me, would have confirmed what I'd always suspected, that whatever he felt, he wasn't going to give it to me, not directly, not in the way I needed. That sentence would have sat in my chest for weeks. That night, it just sat there for a moment, and then it didn't, because I understood something I hadn't fully understood before. Not as an idea, but as a feeling in my body, something true in the way that only things you've actually lived through can be true. His seeing me or not seeing me had nothing to do with who I was. It never had. I was a cardiologist who had just stood in front of 300 people and made a compelling case for work that would save lives. I had driven across the country by myself and built a life in a city where I'd known no one. I had survived a decade of training that breaks people who are less stubborn than I am. I had done all of that without his approval, without his dinners at steakhouses, without his proud phone calls, or his stories told in that reverential tone. I had done it in spite of the absence of those things. I had done it by learning, slowly and painfully, that the absence was his limitation, not mine. A colleague appeared at my elbow to introduce me to one of the major donors, a woman who wanted to talk about the research I'd described, specifically the outcomes data. I excused myself from my parents. My mother squeezed my hand before I went. My father picked up his water glass again. I walked toward the donor, and the room closed around me, warm and bright, full of people who had heard me and understood what I was saying. And I thought, this is mine, I built this. He had nothing to do with it. Not with bitterness, not anymore. Just with the clean, settled certainty of someone who has finally stopped waiting. My parents flew home 2 days later. My mother and I spent Sunday afternoon walking along the seawall in the October light, the mountains clear and enormous on the other side of the inlet, the water going silver in the late afternoon. She told me about the neighborhood she'd grown up in, a story I'd heard before but not like this, not walking beside her while she told it, not at this age. There are stories you only hear correctly when you're old enough to understand what's underneath them. My father spent the morning by himself, I think. He walked around the neighborhood near the hotel. He sent me a text message that afternoon that said, "Nice city, good coffee." I stared at that text for a moment. Nice city, good coffee. Glad you liked it. And I meant it. I actually meant it. Not with irony, not with the layered hurt that those 2 sentences would have carried a few years ago. I just meant it as a simple thing. I was glad he'd come. I was glad he'd seen something. He was not going to become a different person. He was not going to call me in a week with a long emotional speech about everything he'd missed and everything he was sorry for. He was going to go home and watch hockey and tell his friends his daughter gave a speech at a hospital event in Vancouver, and he might say it with something close to pride and he might not say it at all. None of that was mine to control. What was mine? The research, the room, the seawall, the mountains at the edge of a city I'd chosen for myself, the work that was still to do. The life I had built in the absence of anyone's permission. My mother hugged me for a long time at the airport. She smelled like the same fabric softener. "Call more," she said. "I will," I said. I drove home alone through the city. The evening light was doing something beautiful to the glass towers downtown, turning them amber and rose. I found a parking spot near my building and sat in the car for a minute before going inside. I wasn't sad. That surprised me a little. I thought I might be sad. I was just quiet. The way a room gets quiet after something real has happened in it. The way you feel after a long shift when you've done everything you could and now it's just time to rest. I went upstairs. I made tea. I stood at my kitchen window and looked out at the city. My city, the one I had chosen, and thought about nothing in particular, which is its own kind of gift. Some fathers see their daughters the first time they hold them. Some take longer. And some, I think, only begin to look when the world shows them who you've become. When a room full of strangers makes it undeniable. That's enough. It has to be enough. It is enough.